Alright, DraftScience video on the two-slit experiment. PBS. New video, July 16, 2016. The quantum experiment. First they call it a quantum experiment. The two-slit experiment is not a quantum experiment. That broke reality. That destroyed any connection between physics and reality, is the accurate way to say it. It turned physics into a frickin' religion, because they don't want to accurately describe the phenomenon. So let's understand there's two experiments, single slit, double slit, two slits, one slit. Same pattern is created, on, off, on, off, on, off, on, off. Slightly different in the single slit in that the center bar on is much brighter because there's no impediment blocking the middle light, so it's brighter, obviously. And in the two slit experiment, there's the phenomenon of having actually two patterns superimposed on each other. So the finer pattern, on, off, closer together bars, are actually inside of a much more stretched out on, off pattern. So there's bulges in the pattern, and the pattern is inside the bulges, so to speak. And that's the actual experiment, and the math doesn't do anything about that superimposed pattern on a pattern at all. They just talk about the bars, and they don't even take the math out far enough to point out that the math isn't predicting the fact that there's two patterns superimposed on each other in a double slit. And that's the facts, and he won't be accurate to those facts, won't be fair to them, and because they're just propagandists for religion, quantum religion.
Courses Plus. One of the strangest experimental results ever observed.
Nothing strange about it if you understood what it was. So if we understood diffraction, if physics had worked on it more, harder, the idea of diffraction, and took all of the different diffraction examples like rainbows and all these other things, they tend to seem to get that one right? They seem to understand that the photon goes into the electron and it's bouncing inside of the atom and reflecting and and they sort of get it, that it changes its direction because of a kind of manipulation inside the electron, and that the electrons and the atoms are causing the change in the photon's direction. They're admitting it, and it's a new photon. They sort of get it. Two-slit experiment, all of a sudden they lose all of that, and they're saying the photon's moving. It's not being diffracted, no, it's moving. So this was first observed by Newton. Newton's rings are really the same bar pattern, just in a ring form. And it's a diffraction pattern, and as is kind of obvious by Newton's standards even, Newton would speculate that as the aperture gets smaller, the surface to open area percentage gets smaller and smaller and smaller. There's more and more surface per volume. So the odds of a photon traveling near the surface increases as the aperture gets smaller, and coincidentally yeah, causes more diffraction. Yeah, there's no coincidence, I'm being sarcastic. Yes, so that seems kind of an obvious connection. Closer to the surface, more likely of being diffracted, likely of hitting an electron. Yes, that makes sense. It's diffraction, it's not quantum.
There's got to be that of the single particle double slit experiment.
Right, so this single particle double slit experiment, why don't you just say the single particle single slit experiment? Wouldn't that one be even more strange? Because now you don't have any way of making a second photon. Well, unless you use the Huygens principle, the gimmick that you only use for that one circumstance. You don't use it anywhere else in physics except when you have a single slit and you need to make fake waves, an extra fake wave, so you can create an interference pattern. It's a mathematical gimmick. So you're not going to mention that though, huh? Don't you think it would be more strange to talk about the single slit, single photon experiment and why there's an interference pattern? I think that would be more interesting, more strange.
It's one of the most stunning illustrations of how the quantum world is very, very different from the large-scale world of our physical intuition.
Right. The large-scale world of our physical intuition is another way of saying, somehow mocking, the rational senses that we acquire about things having causes for effects, and things not being in 10 places at once, and things not magically showing up on Pluto, and stuff not just appearing in our universe for no reason. Photons don't just exist, pop out of nowhere and show up in your eyeball and indicate there's something over there. That doesn't happen yet in our real world, but it doesn't happen in the microscopic world. It doesn't happen in the submicroscopic world. It doesn't happen anywhere. This whole quantum crap is crap. There's a barely usable mathematics, and it doesn't have any control mechanisms on it whatsoever. It's all paradoxical, and it's all sloppy. The formulas don't define the true relationship, and they don't do it completely accurately, and so they're assuming that because the math can go there, reality goes there, and it doesn't.
In fact, it hints that the fundamental nature of reality may not be physical at all.
Right. I don't see where it hints that. The fundamental nature of reality may not be physical at all. It may not be real at all. It may not exist at all. It's all just a pile of crap. Okay? They're real things. They do real things, and they do it damn reliably. There's no photons pop out of lasers with no batteries in them. There's real causes and effects. There isn't any breaking of cause and effect. Everything has a course. Everything has a destination. Everything has a destiny. And there's none of this mushy, it doesn't know where it is thing. It doesn't. This is nonsense. It's gibberish. It's fucking religion. Excuse my French, but it's fucking religion.
At least in any sense that we're familiar with.
Right, in any sense we're familiar with, like cause and effect, like physical reality, like physical properties. Photons are force. They're like all the other things moving the speed of light. They're force. They're real things. They exist as real things. They have real properties, and they have real limitations. And they don't do any of this magical popping anywhere. They travel places through cause and effect.
Let's start with the familiar. In fact, let's start with a rubber ducky. It bobs up and down in a pool, causing periodic ripples to spread out. Some distance away, those waves encounter a barrier with two gaps cut in it. Most of the wave is blocked, but ripples pass through the gaps. When the new ripples start to overlap each other, they produce this really cool pattern.
Right, okay, this really cool pattern. On, off, on, off, on, off, on, off. Okay, the simplest thing you could create in the universe and call it a pattern. There's no simpler pattern than on, off, on, off, on, off. No simpler pattern in the universe. And yet they will call this strange. They'll say this is obviously this thing because the only thing that could ever cause an on-off pattern. The simplest pattern in the universe can only be caused by one thing. Nothing else besides this one thing could possibly create the simplest pattern in the universe. That's his premise. And it's a silly frickin' premise.
Is called an interference pattern.
Right, now if you use the single slit here, you'll get one wave. It'll just come out here, and there'll be no on-off, no interference pattern, no nothing. That's what a single slit does with water. That's not what happens with a single slit with light. With a single slit with light, the light diffracts, you get a on-off pattern, and you get it because the key ingredient to this experiment are these surfaces. the surfaces. So the single slit experiment is the 2-surface experiment. The double slit experiment is the 4-surface experiment. That's accurately understanding the experiment. That's accurately describing the experiment. The meaningful part of this experiment isn't the slits, it's the surfaces. It's the surfaces that the light passes next to. And the smaller you make the slits, the more likely the photon that gets through will interact closely with one of the surfaces. That's how this experiment works. It has nothing to do with waves. Nothing. And that's proven when you do it with the single slit. If you used a single slit here, all of this nonsense goes away. He has nothing here to compare to light. This is nothing like light with a single slit. So if he just changes what experiment he uses, the connection disappears. And this is what they've based their physics on. They say they've proven light to be a wave because they've chosen to use an experiment that makes it look that way. Not because it is that way. It just looks that way if you isolate one piece of evidence. If you look at it with all the evidence, there's no rational connection between photons and waves, beyond the fact that they both have a frequency.
It's due to the fact that in some places the peak of the ripple from one gap stacks on top of the peak from the other gap, making a more extreme peak.
Right, which doesn't even have anything to do with the photon experiment, because the photon experiment isn't about troughs, double troughs, and double peaks. Here, there's a double peak and a double trough, and then there's an off here. But in photons, there's no double off. There's a photon, twice as many photons, and no photons. That's what creates the pattern. Twice as many end up here. There's no low.
You also get more extreme dips when two troughs overlap. We call this constructive interference.
Yes, and it has nothing to do with photons. Photons don't interfere with photons ever. They just don't. Photons don't interact with photons. They can't change a photon. They can't nuance one. They can't in any way do anything. A force cannot affect force. Just can't. It has to interact with matter to be changed. For a force to be changed, it must interact with matter.
When the peak
to be converted
from one wave encounters the trough from another, they cancel out, leaving nothing. Destructive interference. So, we have these alternating tracks of wavy and flat water. Any type of wave should make an interference pattern like this.
Any type of wave should make an interference pattern like this. Right, so if you use the single slit experiment, you would say any type of wave should create the same wave that's created in the single slit experiment with water, which is no interference pattern. So light can't be a wave because light creates an interference pattern in a single slit. So quite obviously, light has nothing to do with waves. So by your same logic, I can defeat you with the same argument you just made by just pointing to the single slit experiment and say, do the single slit experiment and say what you're saying, because it won't make any sense. Because there's nothing similar between the two experiments. Nothing.
For example, water waves and sound waves, but also light waves.
Also light waves. So the presumption again, we all must believe that photons are some kind of wave, that they're waving through a non-ether, it's not some sort of medium waving. It's not it's not a perturbation, it's not a stimulus, it's not a something in a something. It's somehow a wave made of waviness. Made of what? That's right, nothing. There is no such thing as magnetic and electrical snaking photony thingy. That whole description is just garbage. Electrons have a capacity to create EMF, magnetic field radiation. Electrons, not photons.
Double-slit interference of light was first observed by Thomas Young back in 1801. A source of light passing through two very thin slits produces bands of light and dark.
Right, well, he's not showing Young's experiment, okay, because Young's experiment was horribly crude, and you end up with suns sort of overlapped on each other, and he didn't use he didn't use red light, he didn't use monochromatic light, he used sunlight, and so you ended up with a bunch of blue shifts and red shifts like a prism, so it was even more obvious that it was diffraction. But even from this, you can see this double slit experiment, right? So now you can see quite clearly here. Now the math won't describe this. It won't describe this deterioration to nothing, start up again, go to nothing. But this pattern in these relationships, in terms of the brightness of this, see how bright this is compared to this and this? Well, that's the single slit stretched out. So this pattern here is the same bar pattern as these little bars here, except they're in the single slit intensities. So this is the single slit imposed on top of the double slit. And their math doesn't indicate any of that. So there's two patterns here. There's this interference pattern, and then there's this, and then there's this pattern. Sorry, there's idiots posting things when they never post anything. Yeah, so interrupting my video. Anyway, continuing.
Stripes, alternating regions of constructive and destructive interference on a screen. Of course, we now know that light is...
We now know. So of course, we now know. People will argue when I say obviously, but here he's saying, of course we now know, as if this is a fact. Not, not the unproven, theoretical, I would argue almost voodoo of an explanation. It's such a nonsensical explanation. It's almost as if they're reaching for the most toxic kind of medicine, rather than the truth.
Is a wave in the electromagnetic field.
Right, we all know that. It's a wave in the electromagnetic field. What electromagnetic field? Did what he just say make any sense? It's a wave in the electromagnetic field. So they're arguing there's an ether then. That there's some kind of electromagnetic field that fills space. Is it bent by Einstein's bent space? Is it, what is this field you're talking about? The only field that used to exist, especially when I went to high school, was the fields actually created, okay, by a magnet or electricity moving through a wire. But there was no field there if there's no electricity. I turned the electricity off, there's no field around the wire anymore. There's no electromagnetic field until you excite and create the field. So how does the field get everywhere all of a sudden? I mean, obviously, if light is a disturbance in the field, a wave in the field, you've created an ether. Why don't you admit you just created the ether now?
Thanks to the work of James Clerk Maxwell, essentially.
Now, the work of James Clerk Maxwell was perfectly reasonable in terms of describing the fields created by magnetism and electricity. And it was just wrong, okay? What happened when you accelerate a charge? Now, Maxwell didn't fully understand that concept, that the electron was a charge and you were accelerating it, and it's this acceleration that's creating this perpendicular field, this energy. But light can't do that. Light doesn't have any capacity to produce a field perpendicular to itself. It has only existence in one dimension, the dimension it's traveling in, and has no existence in any other dimension. It has no profile at all. Okay? None whatsoever. It is invisible as a profile. It's only visible when it hits you directly, like a bullet. A bullet's not even a good example because a bullet still has a profile, and you have a fast enough camera, you'll see the profile of the bullet. But light doesn't have that. Light has no substance in any dimension but the dimension it's traveling in. It has no electromagnetic component. It causes electromagnetism when it accelerates an electron by crashing the fuck into it. There's no other ever observed electromagnetic effect from a photon except when it crashes into an electron and moves it. That's it. That's what the evidence says. You shouldn't be saying differently. Liar.
Grenada. So it makes perfect sense that it should produce an interference pattern.
There, it makes perfect sense that it should produce an interference pattern because we've turned it into a wave in a medium. It's not a wave. There is no medium. Light is a thing. It's a fundamental particle. It has mass in one dimension. It moves the speed of light. Just like the force created by a magnet, just like the force created by electricity.
Right? But wait. We also know that light comes in indivisible little bundles of electromagnetic energy called photons.
Yes, but even those aren't really understood as photons, and you're still showing this crap as a representation of what it is. Now, if you drew this as a straight line, and then you took the line out of it, and you just put a dot here, and a dot here, and a dot here, and a dot here, equidistant away from each other, then you would have a description of what photons are. What we call a photon is at least two photons. You can't recognize something as having a frequency unless there is two of them. It's impossible for it to have a frequency unless there are two of them. And coincidentally, as we understand things that might orbit each other, we would understand that something couldn't necessarily orbit something else unless there's a something else. There's no sun orbiting nothing. There's no Earth orbiting nothing. The Earth has to orbit something. So there has to be two of something for it to be captured inside of an electron, let's say. And that would make rational sense that an electron can't see photons that don't have a frequency. And that those things might be called gravity. Somebody might be able to rationally connect those dots and come up with a rational explanation for what's happening rather than this irrational nonsense of vacuous particles waving their way through the non-existent medium.
Einstein demonstrated this through the photoelectric effect, but his clue came from the quantized energy levels of Max Planck's blackbody radiation.
Right, so the clue came from the quantized, the fact that there is no non-cause and effect. The fact that is there's a certain amount, the photons all have this amount, this is what it is. And so yeah, the difference between strong and weak light, red light, blue light, is the fact that yeah, if you fire bullets faster, there's more bullets. And if you fire them slower, there's fewer bullets hitting you. If I shoot a cannonball every 1 minute at your house, you're going to notice the difference if I start shooting them every 10 seconds. It's going to seem like there's a lot more energy hitting you if I fire them every 10 seconds. Yeah, so apparently you need to be Einstein to figure that out.
Law. Check out our episode on this for the details. Okay.
Yeah, for the details. This isn't Einstein's experiment. It has nothing to do with prisms. You know, it has to do with shining light on metal and creating electricity.
So each photon is a little bundle of waves.
No, it isn't a little bundle of waves. So each photon is a little bundle of waves. Now, does that even make sense by their own theory? It has to be a frequency, so it has to have a wavelength, so it can't be a little bundle of waves. A single photon can't be a little bundle of waves. I mean, that's just not an accurate description by your own silly theory. You're not even getting Jehovah's. Your Jehovah's story's got like a Mohammed beard or something. You're fucking it up. You got fucking Goldilocks going to Red Riding Hood's grandmother's house.
Because of electromagnetic field. And each bundle can't be broken into smaller parts.
Well, each bundle, right? The bundle he's talking about is what? A magnetic component that goes one cycle, and an electric component that goes one cycle. And in that one cycle, it goes through the neutral 3 times, obviously. You start, middle, finish. So that's 3 tons by their theory. My theory, it's 2. Yeah.
That means that each photon should have to decide whether it's going to go through one slit or the other. It can't.
It should have to decide. I mean, the very idea that we would even indulge in this conversation about photons deciding, something we know that travels in straight lines. I can quote you Richard Feynman, for fuck's sake, saying kind of obviously that photons basically do one thing. They travel from point A to point B in a straight line. And it's not until they interact with an electron that they do any deciding.
Split in half and then recombine on the other side.
Yes, okay, so this diagram has nothing to do with what they theorize is happening, which is do the single photon at a time thing. You're saying the photon comes up here, and somewhere in here it says, let's go through both slits, and let's create 2 waves, and then let's figure out where to land, and then let's all land in one place. Instead of logically saying, hey, the odds of me hitting near this surface, okay, is higher and higher as these slits get smaller and smaller, and the closer I get to the surface, the more I diffract, the more I'm bent. Because the more energies in the electron I'm interacting with, I'm more likely to hit an electron. The closer you are to a surface, the more likely it is you hit electrons. We've always known that there's field energy around all material surfaces. They all have a static charge. They all have some kind of field energy. And all you're doing is shooting electrons through that field energy. As I bring these 2 surfaces closer and closer, I'm making the odds of the photons that get through, they're going to have to go through that field energy. And the field energy, I don't mean in terms of field energy is the wrong word. They're going to have to go through the complexity, the material complexity of that field, because that field has electrons in it, and those electrons, they're going to hit them, and when they hit those electrons, they're going to be diffracted. They're going to leave in a new trajectory, because they're going to first accelerate the electron a little bit, and then they're going to leave in from the new location the electron's pushed into. And the electron is pushed into a new location based on the field around the material substance. So the thinner the material is, the more likely the electron will bend as it's moving, because the field is bending. So the more bend in the field energy, the more likely when the electron is accelerated, it's going to bend, and as it bends, it shoots the photon in the bent direction. This is not complicated. I mean, I could draw that picture for you. So if you have little tight loops of a field, because you have a thin slit material, or you have a big wide field because you have a big thick material, okay, you can sort of understand that if I accelerate an electron by hitting it here, and the electron moves to here. Now I'm exaggerating, electrons don't move that far, but there's an angular difference. The electron wants to stay on this field line because that's the field pressure is pushing it there. There's a balance magnetically that's going to keep it on that field line. And so as it moves on that field line, depending on where it accelerates to, when it re-releases the energy, because it can't hold on to the photon. So it absorbs the photon, it can't hold on to the photon, it re-releases it in a new direction based on where it accelerated to, its new position. So the closer it is, the tighter this arc is, the more likely the diffraction, the more extreme the angle of the diffraction. So the further out it is, the less change. The tighter it is, the more change. That's diffraction. That's what's happening in the experiment. It has nothing to do with this voodoo. These people haven't given this any thought whatsoever. They've just accepted this dogma, this priesthood of mumbo-jumbo of quantum bullshit. The word quantum is fine. This is quantizable. It means the energy is quantizable. It's the E equals mc squared thing, the only good thing Einstein did. That's what the story is really about. The fact is that matter is energy. The energy is still moving the speed of light inside of you. All the little tons are still moving the speed of light. All the little fish you're made out of. You're a giant school of quanta. And all the little quanta are still moving the speed of light. That's the reality. It has nothing to do with this wave crap.
That shouldn't be a problem, as long as you have at least 2 photons.
No, it still would be a problem because you have absolutely no evidence that photons interact with each other. So even if we accept your silly theory that the photons go through the 2 slits and somehow interfere with each other, well, they don't. You can't make them do it without hitting electrons. You can't make photons change their direction unless you force them to interact with an electron. You can't bend photons. You can't put photons into your accelerators and control them with magnets. You can't control a photon. You can only make it go from point A to point B in a straight line, and if point B is a fucking electron, then you can change its direction. But that's it. There's no other way for a photon to interfere with a photon. You have no evidence that ever happened in the history of mankind, and yet you keep talking as if this is something that happens when photons go through 2 slits. It doesn't happen when photons go through 2 slits. It doesn't happen anywhere in the universe. Photons don't interact with photons. Ever.
1 photon passes through each slit.
I mean, interact in the sense that they can't change anything. They interact like kinetic balls hitting each other. It's as if the balls went right through each other. So yes, photons interact all the time. They just don't change anything. If they miss each other and if they hit each other, the universe looks exactly the same after both events.
Then the 2 photons interact with each other on the other side.
There, the 2 photons interact with each other on the other side. Where is there any evidence in any other experiment that photons ever interact with each other on the other side? Ever. Any place. Ever. Where do you have any experimental evidence of 2 photons interacting with each other? Where? There's no evidence that ever happens anywhere, ever.
And produce our interference pattern. But here, we get to one of the craziest experimental results in all of physics.
Yeah, the craziest experimental results in all of physics. Why don't you do it with a single fucking slit and then talk this rubbish? Oh, that's right, because then you'll have to use Huygens, and then you'll have to admit that's just made up crap.
The interference pattern is seen, even if you fire those photons one at a time.
Right, and so the odds of you getting 2 photons, 2 separate photons to interact with each other is 0, and the odds of getting 1 photon to interact with itself is 0 also. So yes, since you've made up the 2 photons interacting with each other, that lie, you might as well start lying about what a single photon does too, because that's all you're doing. You're just lying. You have no experimental evidence to indicate that photons ever interact with photons. Ever. Ever, 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 ever. Ever. As Feynman said, they go from point A to point B in a straight fucking line. That's what they fucking do, and they don't do anything else. Ever.
Well, let me back up a bit. The first photon is detected as having arrived at a very particular location on the screen. The second, third, and fourth photons also. They deliver their energy at a single spot. and so they appear to be acting like particles of well-determined position.
Right, and this experiment perfectly illustrates exactly the point. The point is it has nothing to do with photons interacting with photons. It has to do with photons hitting positions between these two slits. So obviously, when you slow the gun down, if you're still randomizing the gun, if you're still shooting sloppily across the field in some random way, you'll get exactly the same pattern because exactly the same thing is happening. Each photon is either going close to a slit or in between the two surfaces. It's either going right next to a surface or in between the two surfaces. If it goes in between the two surfaces, it ends up going pretty straight. If it ends up going right near the edge, it ends up getting diffracted. If it ends up going by this edge, it ends up getting diffracted. That's it. The end.
But check it out. If you keep firing those single photons, you start to see our interference pattern emerge.
Right, and let's remember there's two patterns. So this interference pattern has another pattern built on top of it. Two interference patterns. Obviously, one interference pattern caused by the outside edges and one interference pattern likely caused by the inside edges. Something very close to that. I mean, I'm being brief, but that's likely the explanation. One pattern happens because of the interior, one pattern happens because of the exterior. Because the angles are different. Again, this one's bending them in, this one's bending them out. Fuck. I mean in the sense that they're going this way. So these two are both turning the photons this way. Okay? And these are turning the photons that way. This slit and this slit. And they're obviously out of sync, out of phase, based on the distance between them. Shit.
Once again, by the way, Veritasium actually conducts this experiment in his excellent series on the double-slit experiment.
Yeah, like it hasn't been done a zillion million times. And again, this isn't the double-slit experiment. I mean, you can barely see that it's got some resolution to this outside, but again, if he did it correctly with a wide enough slits, he would end up with another pattern, another pattern, another pattern, another pattern. Like I said, you can barely see them in this photo, just ghosts of them here. But the only reason why he's cut it off is because of the size of the slits and the distance between them. So if you adjust the distance between them and you adjust the size of the slits, you can change this pattern rather dramatically. Which he obviously has done for some purpose.
It's really worth a look.
Oh,
This
fuck.
is so bizarre. This pattern...
Again, there's nothing bizarre about it. Go look at the single slit and then use the word bizarre. Because that's when it's bizarre based on your wave theory. Your wave theory turns into absolute garbage when you do this nonsense with the single slit. You'll get the same pattern. There's no possible way to create this second photon unless you use this Huygens gimmick, and it's just a frickin' gimmick. This idea of an infinite number of wavelets being created. The very fact that you physicists will tolerate a principle that has the notion that you create an infinite number of something inside of a fixed distance sort of breaks all of physics anyway. Your basically physics is this whole idea of a quanta, a Planck distance. You've broken all that into a million pieces as soon as you say the word Huygens, because Huygens says there's an infinite number of little micro wavelets inside of this tiny distance. Well, if there are, then there's no Planck distance, there's no quanta, there's none of that shit. So change quantum mechanics into some other word like Huygens mechanics, because they can't possibly be compatible anymore. So you don't even understand the things you call a principle. Your fucking Huygens can't be a fucking principle because it's inconsistent with your other fucking principles. And if you don't know what the law against non-contradiction, jackass, you don't even know basic goddamn motherfucking logic here. Okay? You can't have contradicting principles. Either there is a Planck distance or there's not, jackass. So you can't have Huygens do infinite things if you're saying Planck distances exist, you fucking cunt! I mean, that's why I'm just, you people who keep defending this shitheads, okay, and say there's something other than goddamn disgusting liars and religious kooks. No, that's what they fucking are. Because that contradiction is obvious. Any physicist who isn't afraid of the word infinite and would say an infinite idea is bullshit on its face, that's something that has to be picked apart with a microscope. You gotta be damn fucking sure before you throw the word infinite around. And when fucking Huygens says there's an infinite number of microwaves inside of a fucking wave, you fucking physicists should have enough goddamn character to say that can't be right. You lying scum.
Has nothing to do with how each photon's energy gets spread out, as was the case with the water wave. Each photon dumps all of its energy at a single point. No.
Yeah, you already said that, shithead. And yeah, that's exactly right. And it's a force, okay? And it doesn't dump anything, okay? It interacts with the target.
The pattern emerges in the distribution of final positions of many completely unrelated photons. How can that be?
Because they're diffracted. Because they hit electrons. Because they went near the surface of something where there's a lot of electrons in field locations, fixed field locations. Have you ever seen the field lines around a magnet? Well, yeah, they're in fixed locations, and when you accelerate them in those fixed locations, they don't travel straight lines because they're in a fixed field that forces them to a new location, and that new location creates the diffraction. There, it's been explained.
Each photon has no idea where previous photons left.
Again, this whole fucking idea of sitting and having a conversation where you would premise your conversation on some expectation that a photon would have an idea, that a photon would have some fucking knowledge of anything, that the simplest, most elemental thing you can possibly come up with in physics, I mean, it's the lightest, simplest thing. It's fucking force. It's the one force we can see. We can't see the gravity. We can't see the magnetism. We can see the photons because they have that fucking frequency. But they're made of exactly the same thing. The gravity is the same thing as the photon, just without the frequency. The magnetism is exactly the same thing as the fucking photon, without the frequency, but with the polarization. You stupid shits.
Landed, or where future photons will land. Yet each photon reaches the screen knowing which regions are the most likely landing.
Yeah, knowing which regions. No, it doesn't. No, I mean, it's just so stupid. You force a simple thing to interact with a complex thing, right? So this is the fucking two-slit experiment, right? You're taking these simple things, throwing them at this target, this obstacle, and then you're saying the thing did it, not the obstacle. The obstacle didn't change anything. I mean, if you were doing this with any other kind of obstacle, any other kind of filter, you were throwing something through, and something weird happened, you'd say the filter did it. If the results are different, no filter, filter. You'd say the filter has something to do with it. And these assholes won't even consider the filter. The filter is completely irrelevant. All the filter's doing is forcing the photon to clone itself and fly through both of the filters. That's what they think the filter is doing. That's what they think putting this matter in front of it does. So the complex thing is put in front of the simple thing, and what are they blaming for the behavior? The simple thing. The simple thing did something. No, the filter did something.
Spots, and which are the least likely. It knows the interference.
It knows. I mean, fuck.
Pattern of a pure wave that passed through both slits equally, and it chooses its landing point based on that.
I mean, you just can't even, you can't talk more absolute nonsense. Even as a metaphor, as an analogy, as simple talk, as this is worse than the three bears. This is worse than talking fucking bears. This is like alien bears, or Martian bears, that originally were from Alpha Centauri. So they're originally from Alpha Centauri, and they moved to Mars, okay, and then they came to the Earth and talked. That's how bad this is.
Turns out that the photon isn't the only thing that does this. Shoot a single electron.
Yeah. So the photon isn't the only thing affected by the field energy around matter. Of course, electrons are going to be affected Because they're charged fucking... They're not particles. They're charged material fundament. They're, no, atomic parts. That's it. They're charged atomic parts. Alright? They're things full of photons already. But the point is, we already know they're influenced by the field. So the EMF, any EMF in any location will influence them. Any field energy they're sensitive to. They're also sensitive to gravity. Duh.
Through a pair of slits, and it'll also appear to land at a single spot on the screen, but fire many electrons, and they slowly build up the same sort of interference pattern. This crazy...
The same sort of interference pattern. Yeah, we don't know exactly what that means either. But again, it's just the same argument being made. Obviously, electrons are even easier to bend with magnetism. That's a proven fact. We know the old cathode ray tubes, your cathode ray tubes of your old televisions, they had a big giant electromagnet around the tube. Okay, and that's how they made the electrons go scanning across your screen. They made the electron go there, and they made the electron go there, and they made it go here, and they made it go there. They made it go across that screen 300 times a second. You know, across these lines, across the screen. That's what the magnets did, because they can move electrons with force. Duh.
The effect has even been observed with whole atoms, even whole molecules.
Right, but there's still going to have to be whole atoms or whole molecules that are probably somehow based on something that has a polarized effect. So you're probably not going to be able to do it with something like a marshmallow. But yes, it has to be something influenced by static or electric charge. If it's not influenced by static or electric charge, then all this goes to nowhere. You're not going to bend it. But yes, anything that is affected by charge is going to be diffracted. Yes.
Buckminster fullerene, buckyballs, are gigantic spherical molecules of 60 carbon atoms and have been observed to produce double slit.
Okay, let's understand. Carbon, one of the fundamental elements in stuff like steel, magnetic stuff, you know. Obviously, depending on how you arrange carbon, probably has a lot to do with magnetism. So yes, they're probably chargeable bodies.
Interference under special conditions.
I don't know what the special conditions are. You didn't cite them. I'm sure you didn't leave any evidence of them. So, let's see. Let's see if we have any buckyball crap here anywhere. No, no buckyball link. Okay.
We have to conclude that each individual...
We have to conclude. That's what he just said, right? We have to conclude. We can't do anything else but do this. Stupid concluding. And again, they can't ever draw this thing accurately. The two slits are never this far apart. They're just barely a slit's distance apart. There's just nothing accurate about any of this crap.
Proton, electron or buckyball travels through both slits.
They can't help but conclude it traveled through both slits, even though when they shoot single ones at it, they see the same pattern, which indicates, hey, the pattern's happening because it's interfering with this material in the way. This matter you've put in its way is affecting it. Gee, that's totally outrageous. How could you possibly think the matter I put in front of the photon is causing something to happen to the photon? That's totally irrational. No, that's reasonable. That's what they should have concluded. This is a phenomenon created by the slits, not created by the fucking photons.
There's some sort of wave. That wave then interacts with itself to produce...
Right, and in no other circumstance do photons interact with each other's wave. No other evidence that that ever happens anywhere, ever, and yet they're going to keep saying this shit. as if photons can be influenced by force, and they can't. Because they are force. Force can't influence force. Force can only be converted into a new direction or a new polarization if it interacts with matter. Period.
An interference pattern. Except that here the peaks of that pattern are regions where there's more chance that the particle will find itself.
Right, so we just change the rules a little bit and we'll just say that instead of this wobbly thing, we'll just call this chance. Yeah, there's more chance that it ends up here or here or here. When really the point is what was the chance of it being near the edge or far away from the edge? And that's the chance that decided the fate of the photon. Where it went through this slit, where, how deep, how close to the edge, how far away from the edge. That's what decided where the photon ended up. Nothing else did. That decided right there. That point. No two photons, no interference bullshit.
It looks like a wave of possible undefined positions that at some point...
It looks like some kind of pornography is what it looks like. But whatever, weirdos.
Some reason resolves itself into a single certain position. We also...
Yeah, again, with this single certain position. We know that already. Again, there's no disputing that what a photon is. It's a quanta of energy. It moves in straight lines and cause and effect and conservation. So if something goes in this way, something's coming out somewhere going the opposite way. That's the rule.
All this waviness in position when we talked about quantum tunneling.
Which is another pile of shit video I have to get to, but absolute nonsense. Absolute crap. So the photon, why do they even bother with the two-slit experiment? Why don't they just do this, the thin impediment experiment and just allow the photons, and they could just draw slits on, and then just say, because there's a little more ink where the ink is, they could just say that the less photons were able to tunnel through the surface and pop out on the other side magically because there's a probability that they can do that. Even though it's only a mathematical probability and there's absolutely no real possibility that they can, we'll just pretend they can. They can actually somehow actually go through the matter, and we don't have to pay any attention to the real rules of physics. Because the math says we don't have to obey any rules.
In fact, several quantum properties like momentum, energy, and spin all...
quantum properties that, again, you just made up. You know, momentum, energy, and spin. Well, momentum would be the same thing as energy, I'm sorry to say. And spin, well, what do you mean by spin? And photons don't spin, so fuck you.
Display similar waviness in different situations. We call the mathematical description of this wave-like distribution of properties a wave function. Right,
a wave function. We call the preposterous nonsense that we just made up that the photon didn't actually go somewhere by cause and effect, that it somehow went somewhere by doing probability calculations. Yeah, we call that this wave function thing, this probability function, but there's no real probability, there's inevitability. If the photon goes near the surface, it will be inevitable that it gets diffracted. And I'll tell you, as soon as you can start aiming photons and you aim them around the slit, you'll find out that they're going to get diffracted. And all of this will be moot. So if you could actually do what you say you can do, which is fire single photons accurately enough to do all your fancy experiments, well, why don't you shoot single photons accurately enough to go right around the edges of the two slits, and you'll find that you'll get all of your light will be diffracted. That's my prediction.
Describing the behavior of the wave function?
No, there'll be no magical Huygens. There'll be no Heisenberg nonsense. There won't be any uncertainty at all. You'll know exactly where the photon went. You know exactly what kind of course it took. You know exactly where it hit an electron. You'll know exactly where it ended up. It'll be all cause and effect reality. No broken reality. You're the assholes breaking reality. You're the ones misidentifying the truth and then misdescribing the evidence and misdescribing what is a reasonable conclusion and misdescribing what has been proven. You don't understand any of these words. You don't understand the word evidence. You don't understand the word reason. You don't understand the word fucking proof. You haven't met your burdens anywhere in this fucking conversation. Anywhere.
Is the heart of quantum mechanics.
Right, the heart of quantum mechanics is a stupid, idiotic presumption that things aren't where they are and that they aren't influenced by things that influence them.
But what does the wave function represent?
Crap.
What are these waves of, or waves in?
Exactly. Nothing. It's crap. It's bullshit. It's nonsense. It doesn't make any fucking sense. The thing travels billions of light years across space. It's not waving there. No, it's a thing. It's a bullet. It goes in a straight fucking line.
Let's start with what we do know about the double slit result. We know where the particle is at both ends. It starts its journey wherever we put the laser, or electron gun, or buckyball, trebuchet.
Well, why don't you just keep talking about how you keep shooting things sloppy, and why don't you start talking about, well, maybe we ought to aim something for a change. Can you aim your fucking buckyballs? I mean, electrons, it doesn't matter because you can't fucking aim an electron because electrons are always going to be moved by fields.
And it releases its energy at a well-defined spot on the screen. So the particle seems to be more particle-like at either end, but wave-like in between.
No, it's not any of that. There's a thing in between. You put a thing in between. Can't you see the thing you just put in between? There's no problem in between until you put this thing in between. This thing did it. The thing did it. Can't you see that fucking thing? Do you see they drew this thing and they put it right there in the middle? Can't you see that fucking thing? Well, that fucking thing did it, you fucking kook. Jesus fucking Christ. Why don't you watch your own video and say, Jesus Christ, how the fuck could I say something so goddamn stupid? Obviously, there's no problem in the middle until I put the fucking thing in there. Yeah, the thing did it.
That wave holds the information about all the possible final positions of the particle, but also about its possible positions at every stage in the...
I mean, it's just so fucking stupid. So somehow, all of this calculating is going on, and the magical ether is figuring all this out because there's two slits here. No, none of that shit is happening. The particle either goes close to the slit, gets diffracted a lot, goes far away from the surface, gets diffracted a little. That's all that's happening. Nothing else is happening. If I have a single slit, obviously you could see, if this was one big opening here, you could see that a lot of light in the middle is going to get through. So this middle thing is going to be very bright because none of this light will get diffracted. Only the light that's near the edges will get diffracted. Duh!
Journey. In fact, the wave must map out all possible paths that the particle could take.
Yeah, so it maps out all possible paths, and there are like as many, like you can't even, it's not an infinite number, but obviously it's as many paths as there are thicknesses of photon. So it's not even the thicknesses of the photon, it's the Planck, smallest Planckiness would be the infinite number of path possibilities. So this is all such goddamn drivel. They have no math that can do that. They can only guesstimate. So what's the fucking point? And it's all fucking bullshit anyway, because none of that's happening.
We have this...
And these aren't all the possibilities anyway, because when you really do all the possibilities, then you end up with, it went to Pluto. It went to Pluto. That's one of the possibilities. The photon just arrived on Pluto for no good reason. It just arrived there. It tunneled its way there. That's part of their fucking idiotic theory. That's realistically a possibility. The photon goes through the slit and goes to fucking Pluto. That's part of their silly fucking theory.
Family of could-be trajectories.
Could be, not anywhere near the truth. There is no could be. No, it's not possible because it has to hit an electron here, and the electron can't make it go to Pluto. The electron can only make it go somewhere in here. Hey, that's it. That's the range the electron can bend that photon. It can't bend it to Pluto. It can't make it all of a sudden arrive at the screen. It has to make it go there in the direction. It can only change its direction. It can't change its location. You fucking cunts. You have no